sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 project. He will have a conversation with NBC reporter Dan DeLuce on the subject, followed by a panel discussion. Dan, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Senator Cruz, for doing this. I guess let's get right to it. You have the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister saying this week that he has no doubts that the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline project is going to go ahead, even though there's been a pause for a year now. And we have reports that the vessel Fortuna is starting to lay pipeline in German waters. Is this project going to go ahead despite the sanctions that were just adopted?
No, it's not. And to the surprise of no one who has followed this issue, the Russian Foreign Ministry is engaged in disinformation. And, it was striking. John began this program a moment ago by saying something I don't think I've ever heard in a program I participated in, which is he began by saying, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. That's an interesting commentary about the breadth of interest and attention being played and focused on this issue, that it scopes multiple time zones across multiple continents. And, it's worth remembering right about a year ago is when we passed the first Nord Stream 2 sanctions. And at the time, the Russians were engaged in the exact same disinformation campaign. This is not new. In Europe, the Russians were saying over and over again, these sanctions will never pass. There's no way they can pass. And the pipeline can't be stopped. We now know definitively, as a matter of fact, that was false. And I spent a good portion of last year working to build a bipartisan coalition behind these sanctions. We managed to unify Democrats and Republicans in the Senate and Democrats and Republicans in the House. And we passed the sanctions in December of last year. And construction on the pipeline halted minutes before these sanctions were signed into law. They have had an effect, halting the pipeline in its tracks, and the second wave of sanctions will soon be signed into law. They've now passed through both houses of Congress, and that will ratchet up the pressure even further.
You talked about the first wave of sanctions and now this latest round that just got adopted in the NDAA. What was the impetus to have this latest rounds of sanctions that refer to ensuring and certifying the project? What was the rationale for that?
Well, let's break it into two time periods. The first sanctions that we passed were designed to operate very much like a scalpel. They were narrowly structured to target any companies laying the deep sea pipeline necessary to complete Nord Stream 2. And there were only a handful of companies on planet Earth that had the technology to do so. Those sanctions, to get them passed, we had to get the support of the Republican chairman and the Democratic ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Republican chairman and ranking member on the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Republican chairman and Democratic ranking member on the Senate Banking Committee, the Republican majority leader and Democratic minority leader, and then we had to do the exact same thing in the House. With those same 8 players in the House, we had to build that bipartisan coalition. Once the bill had passed, there was a second wave of disinformation. It's actually hard to track. The disinformation has come in so many quantities. Once it was clear it was going to pass, the next wave of disinformation was that, well, the sanctions would take time to go into effect, and so the pipeline could be completed before the sanctions would go into effect. That was categorically false. And so I wrote a letter along with a couple of other senators directly to the CEO of the company that was laying the pipeline, making clear that under the statutory language, the sanctions are mandatory and the liability was immediate, not in 30 days, not in 60 days. Yes, the first wave of statutes allowed a wind down period, but that did not allow additional construction. And the point that I made to the CEO and I am sure to the general counsel of the company is that if the company continued constructing the pipeline for even 1 minute after the president signed the legislation, the sanctions would be mandatory and crippling. And I do not think it was coincidental that roughly 15 minutes before the sanctions were signed, the company announced they were immediately halting, and the ship, the Pioneering Spirit, was lifting anchor and setting sail. Now, what did the Russians do? Nobody expected the Russians just immediately to surrender. The Russians now are trying to use their own ships to do it. They don't have the technology. They're trying to retrofit it. And so the second wave of sanctions is designed to cut off this second effort from the Russians to complete this pipeline. And the second wave of sanctions that has now passed both houses of Congress is really targeted at the big three. It's targeted at pipe laying activities, it's targeted at insurance and reinsurance, and it's targeted at certification. And one of the important things about certification is, under the terms of the permits that have been granted, third-party certification is required. And this, again, is designed to be surgical, to make clear this project will not be completed. And I'll say this, the international creditors who are funding this project, I think it's going to be a rush to see who gets their money out first, because this project, I believe, will never deliver gas.
What would you say to some of the arguments coming out of Germany why they want to go ahead with this project, and why? And it's still relatively popular among Germans, according to polls. And you have the German government saying, listen, we need this flexibility for our gas supply. This will be a stable kind of supply. The gas prices won't spike, perhaps. What do you say to that argument? That why does the U.S. have to be pushing so hard to stop this project?
Look, I don't know why the German government has seemed bound and determined to get in bed with Putin and Russia on this project. I think Angela Merkel has made and has been making a serious mistake in this regard. I can tell you, if Nord Stream 2 is completed, it would be good for Russia. It would be good for Putin. It would put billions of dollars in Putin's pocket that would fund military aggressiveness, expansionism, and pressure on its neighbors. It would be bad for Europe. We know that Putin is more than willing to use energy to extort and blackmail Europe, and making Europe more dependent on Russian gas is bad for Europe. It's bad for Germany. The European Parliament voted 433 to 105 to condemn the Nord Stream 2 project. There's a reason in that Europe understands putting billions in the pocket of Putin and giving Putin control over a lifeline. We've already seen Putin is willing to cut off energy in the middle of a cold winter. That's bad for Europe, and it's bad for security. And that's why we've seen such widespread agreement, not only in Europe with an overwhelming supermajority condemning the project, but also in the United States with an enduring and durable bipartisan majority.
You mentioned the sentiment in the European Parliament, and of course also there are voices in Germany that also oppose the project, as you know, including the Green Party, which is on the ascent and possibly a contender to be in the next German government. I'm imagining an unlikely headline right now: Senator Cruz and the Green Party in Lovefest. But seriously, do you feel like the political winds are shifting in a favorable way for your side of the argument?
I really do, and it makes one chuckle that it is a bit of an unlikely alliance between a conservative Texas Republican and the Green Party in Germany. We're not, on most issues, natural bedfellows, but in this instance, the merits of standing up to Russia are compelling. The merits of not making Germany subject to the whim. Putin is not our friend. I have said many times, Putin is a KGB thug. And my late colleague, John McCain, who I had the opportunity to travel internationally multiple times with, John had a phrase he used for Russia. He said, Russia is a gas station with a country attached. And if you look at Putin's malign activities, they are all funded by energy revenues. He is essentially a petro tyrant, and nothing good comes of it for Germany. Nothing good comes of it for Europe. Nothing good comes of it for the world to empower and enrich Putin and make Europe dependent on him.
What about the argument you also hear from the Germans and others that really this is all about promoting the U.S. LNG industry? Of course, your state is very important in that industry. What's your response to that criticism?
Well, look, that has been another major theme of the Russian disinformation, is they've tried to say this is all about Texas oil and gas. Now, I have been a relentless foe to Russia and Putin. My father was imprisoned and tortured in Cuba. My aunt, my Tia Sonia, was imprisoned and tortured in Cuba. When it comes to standing up to communist dictators, I have a lifelong record of unrelentingly doing so. When it comes to Nord Stream 2, the national security imperatives are compelling. And frankly, if Germany is not dependent on Russia for energy, Germany will get its energy sources elsewhere. And whether those sources are elsewhere in the world or for the United States, as far as I'm concerned, getting it anywhere other than Russia is a material improvement for everybody.
You talked about the bipartisan support this has, and there's no question this is on a very short list of issues that seems to draw a bipartisan consensus. Are you optimistic that that will still hold as we enter into another administration and after Joe Biden's sworn in January? Are you cautiously optimistic that the next administration will support this approach?
You know, Dan, I'm actually quite optimistic on a couple of fronts. Number one, under the first sanctions legislation that has already passed into law, a report is due from the administration in the coming days of any companies that have committed sanctionable activities. And so I am eagerly awaiting that report. I expect this administration to provide that report to Congress. And under the terms of the sanctions, any company listed on that report, sanctions are mandatory. They're not discretionary. They are mandatory. It is also the case that in a Biden administration, we have had consistently for 2 years now strong bipartisan support, virtually unanimous bipartisan support. You know, your last question was something to the effect of, isn't this all about Texas oil and gas? You know, the last I checked, Nancy Pelosi is not a big defender of Texas oil and gas. Chuck Schumer is not a big defender of Texas oil and gas. And yet, Nancy and Chuck and Democrats throughout the Senate and House have stood united on this. And if you think about last year, so the first wave of sanctions we passed in December, and I'd like you to pause for a second and remember what else was happening in Washington in December. Literally, as this was moving forward, the House of Representatives was in the process of voting to impeach President Trump. Now, one of the countries that is impacted by Nord Stream 2 is Ukraine, because right now a significant amount of Russian gas travels through Ukraine that provides revenue to help keep Ukraine strong and vibrant. In December of last year, House Democrats were impeaching President Trump for alleged misconduct concerning Ukraine. I want you to pause for a second and imagine trying to put together a bipartisan coalition concerning Ukraine in the middle of House Democrats impeaching the president concerning Ukraine. It was, in some ways, it was an absolute miracle we got it done, but in other ways, it is a recognition of the power of the merits of the arguments, because I spent a lot of time meeting in person with my colleagues in the Senate, with Republicans and Democrats and by the way, there were a dozen times where it looked like it might go off the rails and not pass. And that's typical with legislation, that there'd be one problem or another problem. You'd have to go talk about this issue. And we were able to keep the focus not on any potential political distractions concerning Ukraine and impeachment, but instead keep the focus on Russia And let's not send billions of dollars to Putin that he will use to undermine safety and security in Europe and across the world. That there was a strong bipartisan commitment to, and I have every confidence that in the Biden administration, listen, I worked with Joe for 4 years when he was vice president. He has a lot of relationships with both Republicans and Democrats, and the consensus we see on this is very strong. On the other side, there are Russian attempts at disinformation, and I'll tell you what they're trying to tell Europe. They're trying to tell Europe this project is inevitable. Well, when you're, as a discerning listener, trying to assess that argument, I would encourage you to think back to what they said just over a year ago, because they said the exact same thing. They said the sanctions will never pass. This project is inevitable. We now know they were wrong then. They're wrong now also. This project is not going to be completed. And one of the great things about a pipeline is a pipeline that is 90% complete is a pipeline that is 0% complete. Until you complete the pipeline, you're not transmitting any gas through it.
How would you compare this sanctions effort to other sanctions efforts elsewhere in the world, or even as applying to Russia? It does look like, certainly so far, this has been very successful. The pipeline has been halted, and now with these latest sanctions, it may never be completed, it looks like. Is there something to be learned from how this has been approached? Or is this emulating some other effort elsewhere, whether we're talking Iran or Russia or other issues with Russia?
So I think it's a great question, and we can have good and worthwhile discussions about when sanctions are effective, when they're not. I think they are certainly part of the toolkit that we should use in foreign policy. I've always been one who is reluctant to use military force. I think the United States should use military force only to protect our vital national security interests, and we should have a very high threshold for military conflict. Given that, I think utilizing the panoply of other tools we have to impact conduct and to discourage conduct that is harmful to the safety and security of the United States or of our allies, using those tools is important. You mentioned the Iran nuclear deal. The Trump administration obviously pulled out of that deal. I was very vocal in making the case to the president directly that we should pull out of that deal. Both the State Department and the Defense Department advocated on the other side. Both the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense were making the case to the president we should stay in that deal. I think the Iran nuclear deal was catastrophically foolish. And I vigorously made the case to the president on the other side. He agreed with me and pulled out of the deal. I think it's the most consequential foreign policy decision the president has made in his last 4 years. Subsequent to pulling out of the Iran deal, there were a whole series of decisions that played out over the last 4 years concerning, number one, civilian nuclear waivers, which the Trump administration initially granted to Iran to allow some civilian nuclear work, but number two, oil waivers to allow Iran to continue to sell oil on the global market. And both publicly and privately, I vigorously made the case to the president to end those waivers. Ultimately, again, over the resistance of many players at state, the president agreed with me, prevailed. We ended the oil waivers. And I do think some of the strategy that we've seen in both American sanctions on Iran, but also international sanctions on Iran before the Obama deal, were very much directed at finding critical vulnerabilities and targeting sanctions very directly where they can have impact. Ending the oil waivers on Iran imposed enormous economic pain on the government of Iran. That was very targeted because that's where they were getting their revenues. If you look at Nord Stream 2, if these sanctions had been written broad-based, one of the arguments that was used against these sanctions initially was, well, this hurts Europe. Well, if the sanction had been written broadly to target, say, German companies generally, they never would have passed. Germany is a strong ally and good friend of ours. We're not interested in broad-based sanctions. What made these so successful is they target critical vulnerabilities without which the pipeline cannot be completed. And because they are so surgical, I think that's one of the reasons you see such broad support for them. And I have to admit, this second wave of sanctions was much easier to get done than the first. So the first time we were doing this last year, over and over again, I'd get arguments, Ted, this is not going to work. Come on, this is a fool's errand. You're tilting at windmills. Because that's what the constant Russian disinformation said. This time it was actually quite easy to get. Now, I still had to work the phones. I still had to talk to Republicans and Democrats in both the House and Senate. And again, this second wave, just the nature of sausage making, the nature of legislation, there are times when, you know, you've got a ranking member, a chairman in a House committee who's upset about a totally different issue, but could potentially derail it. But this was much easier to get done the second time because I think both Democrats and Republicans have seen this has been successful. We've stopped it for the past year, and I believe we will stop it for the next year, and we'll stop it for the next year. And I got to say, this Nord Stream consortium right now, the funders are listening to the Russian disinformation. And once the capital starts to flee the project's dead on arrival. And it's really going to be a question of which capital leaves first, because some people may get their money back, and some people might be left just out on a limb.
That's a good note to end on, I think. We're over time. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion, and I will turn it back over to Ambassador Herbst. Thank you.
Senator Cruz, that was wonderful. Dan, that was terrific. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. God bless.
Okay, we have an excellent panel to follow up on that wonderful presentation. We have Deborah Kagan, who's a noted